Welcome to Anthology's video on entering non-book inventory part 3. We're going to continue talking about planning, but it will be the wrap-up in this video, and we will go on to setup after this. In this video, we're going to talk about level of inventory control, and we're going to talk about whether or not to use purchase orders. Let's begin by talking about level of inventory control. The first level of control that you have over your inventory is how detailed of a record you create for that inventory item. Let's look at some examples. Let's say that you sell coffee at your bookstore, but it's not something that you take very seriously. You're offering it to your customers just as a convenience, and you're covering your cost. In which case you might create a generic record just called coffee. Now let's say that you have a cafe and selling coffee is very important to you, and you sell many different kinds of coffee, and knowing which coffees are selling over another is very important to you. In which case you may create a record that says Grand Mocha with raspberry flavorings and candy sprinkles. Know that you probably will also be creating many other records thereafter. One that says medium mocha with raspberry flavors, small mocha, orange flavor, candy sprinkles, no candy sprinkles. So every variation on a theme. The question, as always, is how much information do you need to manage your store? With that in mind, consider using generic items for some things. Think about how much maintenance is required. And I want you to know that Anthology can handle as much detail as you need, but some booksellers may find that they're doing a lot of work because a lot of maintenance is required. That stops being advantageous for them. What's an example of that? Well, we have an example of greeting cards and stuffed toys, two opposite ends of the extreme. Let's talk about greeting cards first. With greeting cards, you're going to enter in greeting cards per every season. When you're talking about detailed records, you're creating a record for every card that comes in. Let's say that you have 10 to 20 cards for a season. That season goes through the selling cycle, you come to the end of it, you do return to vendor, the new season starts, you enter in 10 to 20 more records. Go through the selling cycle, return to vendor, next season. How many seasons do you support in your store for greeting cards? And then the next question comes, is it worth the time that I'm going to be spending to maintain it? Now, if it's not, you may find you create a generic record that's a price point. It'll say card $1.99. Now, it's possible that greeting cards is very important to your store and maybe 50% of your store or more. Know that if that's the case, you can go ahead and create those records for those individual greeting cards. Now let's look at the other side, which would be stuffed toys. In this example, let's say that you have 5 different stuffed toys. An example would be a teddy bear, a lizard, and a dinosaur. So you're going to create those records. As time goes on, you've done nothing more. You entered those records in once and never had to touch them again. And so then it becomes no problem entering very detailed records for those items. The next thing to consider is, was it purchased as an assortment? I come across this particularly with bookmarks. I have booksellers who are selling bookmarks that come in an assortment of 6, and when they go to enter it into Anthology, their inclination is to enter an individual record for each individual type of bookmark. And the question I end up asking them is why? Remember, this is all about your ability to manage and report, and there's going to be no advantages to knowing if one type of bookmark sold better than another. Put in one record and keep it simple. And when you go to reorder, you're going to be reordering the assortment, not the individual bookmarks. The next thing to consider is it part of an assembly? And we're going back to the example of coffee for this. Are you going to have an individual record for each part of this? You're going to have a record for a cup, for the lid, for the grounds, for the stir, the cream, the sugar. Every time you sell coffee, you're going to be decrementing each of these individual records. Very unlikely, not worth the work you're going to put in to do that. So is it a part of an assembly? The assumption is that if it is, you're going to account for all these individual items and the cost of selling 1 cup of coffee, which of course is going to be an estimate. If you decide to use generic items, know that it allows you to track multiple items with 1 record. It allows you to track sales without high maintenance, but know for accounting purposes, we're going to suggest, and it's just a suggestion, that you put the generic items in their own department. Consider as well using a high on-hand quantity for the cash register if you decide to use a generic item. We're going to see why in just a moment. One of the downsides to generic records is that you're going to lose a level of cost of goods sold. How much you lose depends on how much information you've actually put on the record, and you may have that vary from generic record to generic record. So depending on how much information is not in there, that's how much cost of goods sold information you're going to lose on that. The other thing is you're not going to use the manufacturer's UPC code. So again, you're dealing with that issue of printing out your own barcodes, using the barcode catalog for the cashier, coming up with a naming convention, etc. Know as well that these items are not typically maintained through purchase orders. So even though you may be reordering them, you don't have the information in Anthology to be able to reorder them from your vendor. So what does a generic record look like? What would be an example of that? We're looking at the record for the coffee. What you're seeing is LG space coffee, standing for large coffee. We have the retail price, so what you're selling it for, at $1.75. We have the list price to estimate our cost at about 50 cents a cup. We're in our tape field, we're going to have a large coffee printing out on the receipt. Our department is cafe. Our section is coffee. And our on-hand quantity is 100. Now notice it says 100, not say 10,000. Remember that we're a book-selling software and 100 titles is quite a few. 10,000 is extraordinary. So these fields aren't designed for very, very large numbers. Consider that when you're entering a number in here. Should you decide to go this route of entering a high on-hand quantity, know that you're going to need to maintain it. As it goes down, you're going to need to go back in and put on-hand quantities back in on a regular basis. Now a detailed record looks something like this. This is actually a real record from a bookseller. This item, which is a tote bag, it had a UPC code on it. When they scanned it in, this was the number. This is the vendor's reorder number. They were selling it for $27. It cost them $13.50. You can see that it's a tote, some kind of tote bag. We have a department of non-book. We have it in a section of t-shirts and bags, and they have a media of non-book. Now that was just their way of organizing their inventory, so it was meaningful to them. Their on-hand quantity, you can't see it here, but it was 3. That's how many they had in their store at the time that I got the record. So that's an example of a detailed record. What you're seeing now is a report, and what I'm showing you is why I'm suggesting that you put generic items in separate departments from those items that are not generic. What you're looking at is an inventory status report. Inventory status report shows you the value of your inventory in one moment in time. This is the value of everything you have in your store. And remember that we created a record for coffee under the cafe department, and we said that we had an on-hand of 100, and we sold 5 of them. The value that we have left is $166.25. Is this a good number? It might be. It might not be. It all depends on what you put on that record. The accountant's going to have to determine that. It's going to be easier for your accountant to do that if they can get in and find those numbers. If it's buried in a department with detailed records, it's going to be much harder for them to pull it out. That's all the considerations for level of inventory control. Let's go on and talk about using purchase orders or not. Know that Anthology is designed to use purchase orders, and there's some very real advantages to doing that. Purchase orders help you control your inventory, meaning it lets you know what you're thinking about ordering, what you have ordered but has not come in yet, and what has come in. When you know what has come in, it establishes a buying history. You know who you bought it from and when. It establishes the cost of goods sold, so you can tell if you're making a profit on that item or not. And with that combined information, you get an idea of which vendor is providing you the best numbers for those items, so you know which vendor is the best vendor to work with. There's all kinds of reporting manager information that you can pull from the reports if you're using purchase orders. There are times when you're just not going to use purchase orders, and one of them is again that generic item. You're not going to create a purchase order for coffee, even though you're obviously rebuying coffee on a regular basis. There are some items you're not going to reorder, and those items too you will not put on a purchase order. If you are going to order them only once, you're going to create the inventory record and never put it on a purchase order. An example of this would be your Christmas items. It's common to buy a Christmas item one time and never buy it again. When you're thinking about using a purchase order, you have a couple of considerations to think about. That beginning inventory, when you put it in, are you going to use a purchase order for that or not? It's possible that you're going to use a purchase order after your beginning inventory. So beginning inventory, you might create the record and then thereafter use a purchase order to represent it. Or you may create a purchase order right from the very start. We, of course, are going to encourage you to create the records right from the start. It creates the best history for you. It is a good idea. However, some beginning inventory is very large, becomes a very large project, and not every bookseller feels they have the time or energy to get it all in using purchase orders. So that's a decision you need to make. There are some items you will never create a purchase order for. There are some items you're going to put on a purchase order after you've put in your beginning inventory, and there's some items that you're going to put on the beginning inventory and get it in there right from the start. If you're considering putting it in right from the start, know that we're going to want you to create the inventory record first, create all the inventory records first, and then send it to purchase order. So as you're considering this, know what kind of project you might be looking at. Existing stores have challenges that new stores don't. That being that they have inventory that's been there for a long period of time, potentially, and they need to do research to figure out who the vendor was, because they may be using multiple vendors for one item. Which vendor did they get it from, when, how much, etc. So that might be a bit of work. A possible workaround for those people who want to get their inventory in but just don't have the time to do that kind of research is to put your store name in as the vendor name, and then go ahead and put in the items in to the best of your ability. From that moment forward, whenever you see that purchase order, you're going to know, because your store name is on it, that that was beginning inventory, and understand the numbers you're seeing accordingly. If you're not tracking using a purchase order, chances are it's a generic item. That's the most common reason. And if you're using a generic item and you're not using a purchase order, when you're creating the record, consider putting in that high on-hand quantity. Here we are back to putting 100 or more in. Now, why am I suggesting that you do that? Well, in Anthology, you have the option at the cash register to warn on last sale. This is what it looks like in the options table. When you do that at the cash register, when you've sold the last item, the cashier gets a message that says, "You've just sold the last of this item. Do you want to send it to a purchase order?" This is a great tool to use. Booksellers love this for book items. However, when you're talking about a generic item, where the on-hand might be 0, every time you sell a copy, this message is going to come up over and over and over again. And every time the cashier is going to have to select no. You risk at some point, besides the time consumption and the annoyance through the day of having to do this, that they're going to get so used to saying no that they're going to stop paying attention. Consider a high on-hand quantity to avoid that issue. But again, remember, it's going to require maintenance. You're going to have to go in regularly and put another on-hand quantity in for another time period. Through this video, we've been discussing level of inventory control and the use of purchase orders or not. We've also been talking about planning as a whole. There's many things we've talked about over the past 3 videos, and this is the wrap-up of the planning. After this, we're going to talk about setup. And so this represents the end of Part 3, Entering Non-Book Inventory. Thank you.